So welcome everyone to this, the last of the breakout sessions. This is documenting RESTful APIs with Spring REST docs. And I'm Jenn Strater. You may know me on Twitter as the code generator. Thought it was a pretty cute pun. So this is going to work, if my slides advance. OK. So this is going to work kind of in two parts. So I'm going to go through a story of how I came into the world of Spring REST docs. And then I'm also going to show a bit of an introduction, how it works, and an example that will hopefully work. We always know how live demos go, right? OK. So if you want to follow along, the slides are published on SpeakerDeck, and then the conference will send them out as well. There should be an automated tweet. I schedule it to go out. Should have gone out about 5 minutes ago with that link as well. In the slides that are published, all of the links should be clickable, or if you download the PDF from SpeakerDeck, you can click on them. And it'll give you the links to all of the references and examples and everything. So that is kind of the logistics of how this is going to work. The next part is about me. So who am I and why should you listen to me, right? So I am a lot of things. I've been doing this for a little while, and I'm also very involved in some community things. You may know me from the Groovier community. I co-founded an organization called Great Ladies. I go around and talk about that. I also work on some introductory workshops in the different places that I've lived. You may be able to tell from my accent that I am originally an American, but I've been doing some traveling. So right now, I am working for a company called ZenJob. So ZenJob, as it says here, is a fully automated staffing agency. I'm actually in Berlin right now. So I've been there as a senior engineer since June of this year. And like everyone else, we're hiring. So if you are interested in either moving to Berlin or if you're already there, we are looking for lots of things from Spring and Groovy, Grails, DevOps, React. We are really funded and moving really quickly, so we've got positions for lots of different things. But actually, the subject of this talk was about some work that I did before I went to Berlin. So, well, the year before that, I was in Copenhagen doing some things with open source, but back in, 2015 now, it's been a while since I started with Spring REST docs. I was consulting at a company in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and through an agency called Object Partners. And the work that I did with them is how I got started with Spring REST docs. OK, and I'll go into a little more detail on that. So that is a bit about me. I would like to also know a bit about you. Everyone's coming from different backgrounds, and we've seen different things throughout the conference. So I assume if you're here that you have either experience or you have at some point in this conference seen how to create a RESTful API. Who, by kind of show of hands, is familiar with doing that with Spring Boot? OK, almost everyone. Is anyone familiar with Grails? OK, a handful. And is anyone familiar with a small framework called Ratpack? Woohoo, one hand in the back. OK, so they're different. Well, these work because there's 3 very different ways to create APIs, and the way that we document them is going to be very much influenced by kind of how they work underneath. Then on the other side, what have you used in the past for API documentation? And I put all of these up here because they are things that I've used. So I totally admit that we have used wiki pages, we've used Word docs. I think even some of the things that we're doing now at my current company are in Confluence. So who is using just regular standard handwritten, or not handwritten, but docs that are written by developers and our product teams. Okay, about half. Who actually gets to write some documentation style code, gets to do AsciiDoc/Asciidoctor? Okay, one. So I'm gonna spend some more time explaining what that is then. Okay, and the next thing, the next level of the extreme, who does completely auto-generated documentation using something like Swagger and or RAML? Okay, so a good number. So we at least have a basis there for what exists in that space. So now that you know a little bit about me, I know a bit about you, I feel pretty confident that I can tell you my secret. I hate writing documentation. And I say that because I'm a developer too. So it's one of my least favorite tasks, but I know that it is also so very important, which is why I put the asterisk there. It is not that I don't like documentation, it's that I don't like all of the manual steps that are involved in writing documentation. So when I was consulting on this project, I was less than amused, perhaps even a little bit irked that I was given this task to centralize all of our documentation. So that meant going to each of the different teams in this giant enterprise and figuring out what everyone was using, what frameworks we were using underneath, what tools existed, and what we could do as a company to make that uniform and maybe even put that in the same place. So as I started this journey and started doing the research, I found a few different things that were kind of common across the organization in all of the different teams. So the first thing that comes up is this idea of what even is REST. Are we really using REST at all? And I have to admit, so I'm not really a fan of the whole right versus wrong REST debate. That's not why we're here. I wanted to look at, and where I like this image in particular is because of the way that it categorizes APIs. And each of the teams could kind of figure out where we fit in this diagram. So this comes from a blog post by Martin Fowler. If you haven't read the whole thing, it's kind of interesting, and the link is there in the slides. So what we found when we were going through this is that we at least didn't have any that were completely unorganized. We usually had APIs that were sitting somewhere between having established maybe a basic pattern for how our URIs were set up and maybe using the right HTTP verbs and following the HTTP standards. But just because most of our APIs fit within this level didn't mean that some of them didn't include hypermedia or that we wanted to limit ourselves to not using hypermedia just by picking a documentation tool. So this in particular comes in with those of you that have used Swagger. If you're familiar with Swagger 2.0, it didn't at this time support hypermedia. So this is a kind of comedic slide that conveys a very interesting and important point, particularly when we talk about documentation. So if you, I see a few people chuckling here. If you haven't seen this slide, it's great. I got it from a member of the Groovy community called Alvaro Sanchez. You should follow him on Twitter and go watch the original talk that comes with this. So the idea here is that if you start with a big disaster in your monolith, splitting it up into microservices isn't going to help. With documentation, this actually creates some more problems too, because when you go from your giant monolith to your microservices, you now have several different services that you need to document to. And so you have some choices when it comes to, do you want that all in a centralized place? Do you want each API to have different documentation? And so that was one of the things that, and decisions that we had to make. And then the next thing was, okay, so now that we have all the different services, how are we going to kind of centrally document certain things that are similar? So maybe our security. We were using like JWT tokens with OAuth 2, and that's kind of common across lots of different APIs. That's one thing that you kind of need to document once, say, okay, we're doing it, here's an example of how to connect. But you don't need to keep repeating that on every API, or even in some cases, on every endpoint when we were looking at users. Oh, looks like Mike is, okay. Yeah. So those are kind of some central themes to our APIs and the way that they were designed. The next kind of idea that comes up, and this is an important one, it's document design. So this is something that no individual tool is going to solve, but it was a very big factor in why we chose the way that Spring RESTdocs works. So kind of by show of hands, who has seen this before and who knows what this is? Okay. Now, for the people that have not, can you tell me what this means within about 5 seconds or less? It wasn't very straightforward to a lot of people that looked at our APIs that were using Swagger. So even our CTO, who is a technical person, didn't get this from the beginning. The design is very URI-centric, and it requires some jargon and things that we as developers know, but maybe our product teams aren't as familiar with. So this is actually the Swagger UI. So the concept, though, here is not just limited to Swagger. There are lots of companies that use this as a way to document their APIs. And so common theme here, no matter what you do, whether you choose to continue using Swagger or to use Spring RESTdocs, please think about the way that your docs are designed and that information and who is actually going to be able to read this. So the alternative to that is to use a different model. So this is actually what comes from Spring RESTdocs, and it's not Spring RESTdocs that picked this in particular. It is AsciiDoc, a tool called, or a documentation style of AsciiDoc, and we compiled that using Asciidoctor. So this is a very different way of organizing information. The URIs are only really used in the examples. We're instead using concepts to build our table of contents. And this is a lot better for the other people in our organization that were really looking through this more than we were. Okay. The other thing that a solution like this brings is that it's not completely auto-generated. So you can add and insert any information that you need to between your examples. So you can add information that might be context relevant. You can kind of switch this up as well. Okay, so that kind of goes through the different things that were important and some common themes that we're then going to apply to what was available in tooling at the time. So if we split tooling out into kind of 3 main categories, and then, of course, this is a diagram, so there's some overlap. The first one is really about definitions. So Swagger is really a definition, and RAML too, for how you define your API. It's not really about documentation, but we can make it about documentation when we combine it with tools like AsciiDoc and Markdown or even some wikis. And there are, of course, tools that help you do that. The third thing that comes in is testing. So where can we enforce or help ourselves with documentation and testing? So there are tools that fit in the space between testing and definitions, and Swag UI kind of fits in the middle here. But where Spring RESTdocs really shines is in this intersection between testing and documentation. But in order to get there, we need to back up a bit. So let's start with the definitions. Now, most of the people in the room had at least some experience with Swagger, and I guess I probably should say this too. I keep saying Swagger. It is actually now the Open API initiative and gone through a different revision. Way back when I was actually doing this research and study, it was all about Swagger. Okay, so there are, in our ecosystem, two major ways to add Swagger to your projects. The first is a fully automated approach, and there's a library that exists called SpringFox. And SpringFox is actually really easy to get started with. It was already being used on some of our projects. It involves adding a couple of dependencies, and I think in one case it was as few as 10 lines of code to configure the way that it reads into your code and generates a Swagger specification. And even if you're looking at this today, it does include up to 2.0, but of course hasn't included the Open API spec 3.0 yet. Okay, but that had some problems with it, involving kind of what happens anytime you get something just out of the box. You have to start overriding, doing a lot of config. So the other alternative, and particularly if you can't use something like SpringFox because things like Ratpack don't accommodate it, you can maintain your own Swagger specification, and this is what a lot of organizations do. But I already talked about the fact that I don't like all the manual steps in writing documentation. Why would I want manual steps of maintaining this myself? The biggest problem comes in here when you have to maintain it. So you make some small change, and now you have to remember to go back and update this too. Okay. But Swagger is not just about the documentation, of course. There were other reasons why you may be using Swagger, including if you're plugging into any of the other client stub libraries and things like that. But in our case, we were just using it to use this tool called Swagger UI. So no matter how you get there, whether you're using an automated solution or a manually generated Swagger stub, you can generate the UI in a very simple Swagger UI library. In a similar way, there's of course a SpringFox library for this that will automate it, but you could also maintain your own, particularly if you want to reskin this, style it for your own organization and such. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how all of that works. But the next thing is, of course, the downsides. So there were some problems when we got started with this, and reasons why some teams were using it and some teams really weren't. And the biggest problem, or one of the big problems, came in with customization. So at the time, we had kind of a non-standard way that we were setting our authorization. We were using some interesting headers, and this wasn't supported out of the box by the SpringFox UI. The next thing that came up is the way that our objects were mapped. So by default, when you just do a regular mapping, it comes up with this like response type of my custom whatever model. And in order to override that, you have to then define out all of these things. And this is for every model, for every controller, everything. We were writing more and more annotations. But another problem that came in, of course, was the hypermedia thing. So this is a slide that lots of people use in their Spring REST docs documentation talks. And that is that in the older versions of Swagger, hypermedia was closed, considered not as per design. And that was, if you go back and watch Andy's original talk, one of the main focus points on why he created Spring REST docs in the first place. Okay. But going back a little bit, this is actually an example that I renamed all the things so that I could put it on a slide. Came from one of the teams that was using Swagger. So this is a lot of code. And a lot of it is coming just from our documentation. This is a spring conference. We're all really on board with using annotations, but it can really start to get excessive when you start adding things just to document, when really you could be scanning and reading and writing tests that help you get more out of this. The other kind of interesting thing here is that there's no verification that this is actually correct. So if we remove all of those annotations, we get something that's much, much smaller. And if you multiply this across, I mean, this is just one method. Across every method on every controller, it was actually really hard for me to read the code, because of course this is not actually what it said, and figure out what was going on with this team's project. Okay. But it's not all problems, of course. There is one advantage to Swagger that no one else can seem to replicate, and that is the try it button. So I've updated this, hopefully you can read it. On every one of those lines, if you expand it out, you get this option to try it, and that gives you a place where you can kind of manipulate the JSON. As a developer, you can actually put in stubs for what you think this endpoint could be, and people can try it. Our QA team really loved this. We as developers wrote an example, they just click the button, oh, it works. But that can kind of create a lazy way of testing too, because you're only testing the conditions that you put in this. And it's really manual testing, it's not automated testing. So it was really sad to kind of get rid of this. But there are alternatives. So as Spring RESTdoc develops, there are things that we're getting towards having more of an interactive experience. And the one that I use at my current job is actually Postman. So Postman, if you aren't, so who is familiar with Postman? Okay, so most of the room. It's a really great tool for interacting with endpoints. And so we use it currently, and you can set it up as collections. And there's actually this integration now with Postman that you can integrate into your documentation, this button that will take you then to a collection. It's a really great feature. And hopefully, it will be integrated into Spring RESTdocs. This is one of the things that maybe, hopefully, I will get time to contribute to soon, because it's really something that I want at work right now. Yeah, so it's not just about automated tools. You can also, of course, go old school and use curl as well. And when you have a solution like Spring RESTdocs that generates curl statements for you, you don't even really have to think about what parameters to put in there to at least get started. Okay. But it's not an either-or solution either. You can, of course, always mix and match. And there are some libraries and tools that you can use to do that. The first of which is called Swagger. So I harped a lot about how we didn't like the Swagger UI. And that doesn't mean that you have to get rid of Swagger itself. You can use other tools and other libraries to get that same experience that you do with Spring RESTdocs and AsciiDoc by using other libraries. One of the other things that I kind of talked about was this mismatch. So there's no verification out of the box that what you wrote there in the annotations is actually what happens. So you can end up with issues where maybe what you documented isn't what actually happened. So there's, of course, a library that does that. And these libraries are both written, or at least one of the contributors is the same person. So if you look him up on GitHub, he's got lots of examples of mixing both Swagger and Spring RESTdocs as well. Okay, so there is another kind of library that also fits really nicely into this section. So who else was in the talk right before this about Spring Cloud Contract? Okay, a few. If you weren't, you should go back and watch it. It was a really great and actually kind of amusing talk. And so Spring Cloud Contract is a consumer-driven or a contract-first way of managing your APIs. And so you should look at that, and it's kind of better in the diagram. Okay, so now we've done definitions, we've talked about some basic documentation, and two of the libraries that kind of fit in this space, as well as some libraries that fit between definitions and testing. And where that contract first is where the Spring Cloud contracts will fit in. But there's one thing here that's not really covered very well, and that is where Spring RESTdocs fits in, between your testing and documentation. Okay. So this came out of the idea that there has to be something better, right? That we had some problems, but we can fix some. So the biggest problem that we saw was in maintaining the test cycle, and maybe we could use this to generate documentation too. So we start with our basic red-green refactor test-driven development, and now I'm going to make it test-driven documentation. So I'm going to start with a failing test and add some documentation, and now our tests are going to pass again. Whenever I refactor, I add something new, I change the name, I change the data type, my tests are going to fail again, and I have to fix my documentation before my tests are going to go green. And this really works as a great solution because it always ensures that the documentation is actually matching our implementation, and that we actually ended up writing some more tests too. So it encouraged some better practices, it removed a lot of duplication, things that we were doing in annotations and in tests, and it removed a lot of that muddying annotations from our source code. And so Spring RESTdocs is one implementation of this concept of test-driven documentation. And it even goes further than just those things and makes it better for us in the Spring realm. So it takes those tests that ensure that everything's up to date, and it generates real examples. So we're generating code snippets that we can use in our documentation directly. When hooked into the build pipeline, either Gradle or Maven, that means that you can't proceed until all of your tests are passed. But the things that is maybe interesting to people who are using some other frameworks is that it can work in places where you can't generate documentation. So I mentioned on the first slide Ratpack. So Ratpack is a asynchronous, non-blocking, all the buzzwords, little micro framework that has a very unique way of handling routing. It does so dynamically, and so it uses some pattern matching and things that are going to make it really hard to read or parse that by any generated tool. But we can use Spring RESTdocs in Ratpack, and I did so in an example for them, that makes it much easier. Okay. So enough about the background, right? Let's actually get started. Let's get working. So it is, of course, a pivotal project. It's a part of the official Spring team. It's a documentation tool. The docs are really good, so you should read them. Please read them. There's also some kind of interesting things, so if you want to connect, see what's new, see other presentations, there is, of course, a Twitter account, and you can contribute and see all of the things on GitHub. Okay. There are also in the slides that went out some links to other videos about Spring RESTdocs. But that's just the generics. So out of the box, and I guess it's time for a little history too. So this has been a project for at least 2 years now. And when I started, there was, actually, I was right on the edge between when there was only mock MVC and when a newer testing framework called Rest Assured was added. So mock MVC is really great for its integration with Spring and Spring Boot and everything, but Grails and Ratpack are these other frameworks that you can't really use because it doesn't integrate well with that. So you can use a much stronger testing framework like Rest Assured to do some things that you couldn't do with mock MVC. Because mock MVC, of course, runs against a mock of your application versus Rest Assured, which can run against even remote APIs. And this is why, or one of the things that's really cool if you haven't seen the new Spring Boot 2 stuff, that WebTestClient adds the features of both of these so that you can get even further and more concise and better tests. Okay. And of course, I'm a Groovy person, so my examples are Groovy and Spring Boot and Gradle. But that's not a limitation. There is, of course, examples and everything else with Maven as well. Okay. So I'm mostly going to focus on the AsciiDoc part, but if you really want to, you can use Markdown too. And if you get lost along the way, or if you're using a different framework, there are lots of sample projects on GitHub included in the repository. The Spring Boot ones, of course, the Grails one that I contributed, although I do need to update it. So I will do that soon. And then there's other testing frameworks and everything too. These are just what's officially included. There's also now some third-party extensions that will help you get even further with things like Jackson and WireMock and et cetera. Okay, but let's see some examples. So I definitely like to make things a little groovier. I'm going to go through Spring Boot and probably not the Ratpack or Grails ones today. So I started with a basic Spring Boot project with Groovy and added the Asciidoctor Gradle plugin, some basic docs. Then I actually have updated this now. It is updated. It's using the new WebTestClient in Spock tests, which I don't know if you've seen here yet at this conference. And then I'm going to publish these docs to GitHub pages. Okay. And so all of this is kind of going to work together. But of course, it's not Spring MVC anymore. We're now going to make it using the Reactor stuff. Okay, so I originally generated this using lazybones, and we've got some few examples, but you can, of course, use the Spring initializer or the start spring.io stuff too. And so that'll bring us to actually having some endpoints here. So the idea is that we have 3 basic things that you can do. It's a generic greetings API. We can create a new greeting, we can list them, and we can get one by its ID. Once we have a kind of a basic app, and of course, I'm kind of going about this backwards from a test-driven thing, right? If you're starting with a completely new application, you'd start with all of this in a different way. But most of the projects that we work on and most of the examples, of course, you start with an API, and then you add in your documentation and your tests. But this is an example of an AsciiDoc. So AsciiDoc is a format, and if you're familiar with Markdown, it may look very similar. The idea here is that you have very minimal syntax related to style, and then you can set separate style information other places. This is focused on just the content, just the words that are there. And when you get a document that's in AsciiDoc or similar for Markdown, you can use plugins such as the Asciidoctor Gradle plugin to convert this into nice documentation. So there are lots of things that you can do with configuration. This is kind of the standard one for Gradle, but like I said, it's the same for the other tools. But when we actually go and run this, so if we run Gradle, we take that original document, and that was, of course, just an excerpt from it, and we get this as output. This is just the HTML version. One of the other nice things, it didn't seem like there were too many people that were familiar with AsciiDoc and Asciidoctor, that no matter what you're using for your tool in the end. You can publish to multiple different formats from the same AsciiDoc. So you write it once, and then you export it to HTML, PDF. There are even people using this to write books. It exports to an EPUB. And there are lots of other third-party integrations, too. So the idea that you start with one document and create multiple different formats is also a kind of nice thing. This, of course, isn't specific to Spring REST Docs, but it's what Spring REST Docs uses and integrates with. OK. So we have our app. We have a basic document, but we haven't hooked anything together yet. Next thing to look at are the tests. OK. So with the new WebTestClient stuff, the differences are mostly in syntax if you look at the other examples. It's setting, let's see. So actually, I should probably back up. So who's familiar with Groovier and Spock? A handful, OK. So this is a basic Spock test. It's very similar to JUnit, just different syntax. And you can set up everything to run on every test. So we bind it to the application context in this case. But if you haven't seen the WebTestClient stuff, you can also set this up to go to individual controllers. You can set this to go to remote URLs and lots of other things as well. I'm going to start with the base URL being greetings, just because that's where my API is. But you would, of course, use that with your own. If you're also a Groovier person, hopefully I can save you some work that remember to use the right version of Spock. OK, but this is kind of the more interesting part. So we're doing a post to the endpoint, and we're going to create this new greeting that has a message, hello to all of you. And we're going to expect that everything's going to return an OK. And all of this should look familiar in things that you're already doing with your tests. And adding the documentation into this is going to be pretty simple. And we can use a lot of what's already here to do that. So how do we do that? So we add in some basic Gradle configuration things that are maybe helpful for later. And we need to set it up. So we're going to hook into every call that the WebTestClient makes and start reading the requests and responses from those. So we need to do that with this JUnit REST documentation. There's lots of different options if you need to manually configure this in a different way. But the main thing, so to set up there, and then to hook it in as a filter, which is just telling it to read those requests and responses. We take the test that we had before, and we add a consume with. So consume with is just an interceptor in the test that says that I want to do this documentation thing. Syntax-wise, the first string is just a directory instruction for where you want to go. You can even set this up if you're not using the fancy long string names that Spock uses and using JUnit. You can parameterize this so that it will pull your method name for you and do any number of pre-processing, so pretty printing, for example, and then the last part. So this is really what Spring REST Docs does. So it takes a list of fields. In this case, it's just a message. It's our simple hello world of greetings, and verifies that you have those things. It verifies the type. Now, there aren't that many types. But you can see where this, hopefully, you can extrapolate to where this might be especially useful in more complex examples. This description field is then something that you can use and insert into your documents later. Similarly, you'll notice that this is going to get very big very fast. And I'm not a fan of manual steps, so I like to automate things. I'm going to make some reusable snippets. And instead of creating a huge object mapping, I can define it once and then reuse it and say that every test is going to return this type of greeting. In this case, a list of all of the different greetings. Okay, so you get some interesting error messages, but we probably want to see what this looks like, right? Because now it's here. Okay, now we've hoped that I have everything set up correctly and the internet works and all of the other things, right? Okay, I'm gonna just mirror this because I can't see that all the way over there. Okay. My icons are huge, but let's put this in presentation mode. Okay, so we start with the greetings controller spec, and this is everything that I've put on the slides up to this point. We have all of the different endpoints. So one of the things that might happen is that you change field. So in this case, I'm using the MongoDB thing, so the ID is a string. But maybe and this actually happened, maybe I expected it to be a number the first time around. So if I go and try to run something that returns a greeting, so let's do this one. Okay, and of course, yeah, so I set these up stepwise, so it has to go and create a list or a greeting and then run all of the different tests. And it might take a while, depending on our connection. Actually, yeah, you can't really, okay. So we had a failing test. So what happens, it says that the documented type of field ID is a number, or we expected it to be a number, but it's actually a string. Of course, again, this is JSON, but you can see where this might be helpful in more complex examples or like say XML. The other kind of thing that's gonna happen is that you change, let's go put this back to a number. You change, wait, sorry. This back to a string. You change the name of one of your fields. So this is now name. And if I rerun this, hopefully it'll be cached and run a little faster this time. No. Okay, anyway. So we get some interesting output that will help with debugging things. And it's running. Okay. So we get two pieces of information. So we get that there was something that wasn't documented, so we still have this old message field, and that we have this new field called name that we don't know anything about. But once you get all of these tests passing, then we can do lots of other interesting things. So let's go back and fix this so that it passes the next time. Okay. So if we look at the major directory structure, I usually, well, actually, so this is the default. So you put your docs in source AsciiDoc, but you could configure it to go anywhere else. And inside this greetings.AsciiDoc is a bunch of references to these snippets. And this is something that's kind of interesting and has changed a bit in the life of Spring REST docs. So you can, in AsciiDoc, actually I should do the other one first. So you can use this operation called an include. So include will just fetch something. It can be a remote reference. It can be something within your project. So in this example, we're pulling from this directory, and this is what was all set up in the Gradle config or the Spring REST docs config itself, that in our error example, I only want the response fields because I want to show what a standard error message looks like in this case, because that's configurable across all the Spring stuff. And, but if we add in the AsciiDoc module that Spring REST docs provides, we can actually shorten up a lot of these include statements. So if you look at some of the older examples, there's like a ton of different includes, because every one of these, every curl request, HTTP request, and response needs to be added separately. But we can, of course, modularize this and get even closer to kind of some generated documents. And that's done via this operation. And then, of course, you pass in the same thing. So you pass in the name of your example. And then you say either what snippets that you want or an empty list if you want all of them. But I should probably show you an example that has something running. I don't think I have an older, oh. OK. So by default, things go into this generated snippets folder, and you get a whole bunch of different options that you can integrate into your ASCII docs. So you can integrate a curl request, and this is, of course, the format, but it'll get stylized when it goes into your document. You can, we've seen the HTTP request. If you're more of a fan of HTTP, that's in here too. You can also get just the response, or you can get the response as a table. And usually I use the table. But you can see where maybe your example is more nested. You want just to show a small piece of what's going on. You can take just parts of your response and say that you just want that. And so that would be a request part. It's similar things if you have path parameters. So in get by ID, the URL is set up so that it's /ID. If you have more, then those would be in that table. OK. Post example, that was the other one. OK. Yes. So the examples that we get generated by Spring REST docs, we put into our documents, and then we get either our HTML, PDF, or the output of your choice. But sometimes this doesn't work for you the way it is. So everything in here is configurable. And so one thing that I really like to do in some of my examples is to add an optional column to the table. So I can create this AsciiDoc snippet, which is just a template file that I can change throughout my entire project what will happen. And so instead of the normal example is just path type and description, and I added this fourth column optional, which says whether or not something is optional for the request parameters. And so if I, for example, add in, where am I, main model, OK. So I add a new field foo, but that needs to be dot, shoot. Is it not null? OK. Anyway, there's an annotation here that I have in the notes, which are not on the screen, of course, that annotate that this is something that if it's there, then use it. If not, then you can skip it. And so then you can kind of hook this in and make a bunch of different modifications. So this is kind of like how you would progress through different development cycles. OK. So those are just a few of the things that you can do with Spring REST docs out of the box. So I think I went through, yeah, error messaging. Okay, so there is actually another thing that you can do to make this a little bit different. So this hasn't been updated for the WebTestClient stuff, as far as I know, but there is now a Spring Boot annotation that will configure it with mock MVC. And so it takes a lot of that standard boilerplate, again, boilerplate stuff, and condenses it even further. But of course, that's only if you're in that special use case. Okay. So we added the snippets. We now have all of the different steps towards making this into a document. We have our app with endpoints. We have some tests. We have a doc. We have the snippets integrated into our document. And when we take all of the documents that are there, run a task called the Asciidoctor task, which of course would be similar from Maven, then we get an HTML file that looks very similar to this. So this is the Greetings API. It's published in the example using GitHub pages. So now that we have our doc, there are different strategies that we can use to publish it. So usually, you would think that you would publish this to a central place and do this remotely. And there are lots of different ways to do this. I did this using using a custom Gradle file and a plugin called Gradle Git, which just says that I want to take things from this build folder that in the output and push those to the GitHub Pages branch. But of course, there's always gotchas, right? So this can become a bit of a problem too, because now you're getting out of sync again. So if you use this method, please, please, please remember, because I often forget to when I'm doing the demos, to publish your doc every time you do a deploy of the project. Okay. You can, of course, also publish this to a static assets directory, and there's lots of Spring Boot basic examples for how to do that. But this is where they're published on GitHub, and that concludes kind of the rest of the basic talk. So it's not just about MockMVC, WebTestClient, and Spring Boot. You can also use other frameworks like Rest Assured to do other things in the Groovier community. So in particular, this came in with Ratpack. So there is an example project on GitHub that I contributed the Spring REST docs to. And yeah, so this is the route handling in Ratpack. It looks a bit different for people who've never seen it before. The idea here is that you're getting a book, you're getting all the books, and you're creating a new book. And it's manipulating some data in a few different ways. But this is all curly braces. It's not really like code, it's a DSL. So it's really hard for any generated tool to read this in a standard way. So we can do this using Rest Assured. And it filters in a very similar way as the WebTestClient stuff does. The syntax is just a little bit different. And that's because it works very differently. So it runs against like kind of after the request, so it's harder to like mask URLs and stuff like that, but that's all in the docs. So we of course get a very nicely published book document or book API documentation from that example. It's also powerful enough to use public APIs. So you may be wondering, like, why would I care about using a public API? Maybe it's something you don't have access to, something on another team, something that's not in the Spring ecosystem. You can document other APIs too, and I actually want to see if I can, well, I should be able to do this with the new WebTestClient stuff too. Okay, so coming to the end. This project was started like 2 years ago now, I left there about a year ago. As of then, they were pretty happy with Spring REST docs. It was a great way for them to kind of put everything together. They had a lot of options as far as making things customizable, but looking very uniform. And yes. So there's lots of other things you can do. This is, of course, just a basic Hello World example. There's information in the docs, which are great, of course, because it's a documentation tool, that go into how you add securities and headers. You can add constraints very similarly to the way that I did the optional template. I didn't touch on hypermedia support, but that's a very, very important part of this, of course, using XML instead and Markdown. There's also a growing number of third-party extensions for this. So if you're using other things, you're using WireMock, the Spring Cloud Contracts stuff, there's actually an interesting part of the Spring Cloud Contracts documentation that goes through how you use them together. You can use the stubs that Spring Cloud Contracts generates and hook this all into documentation. Okay, so in conclusion, Spring REST docs was a really great tool for our use case. No matter which documentation solution that you choose, please think about all of the different things, who your users are, how easy it is to maintain in the long run, all of the different problems that you face with API documentation. And of course, I still don't like writing documentation, but at least Spring REST docs makes it a lot easier. And if you want to learn more, there's of course a Gitter in the Spring Projects group. The slides, of course, were published, and you should follow me on Twitter to find all of the slides and everything else too. I actually am not sure where we are on time anymore, but I assume, I'm sticking around. If you have questions, you can ask them either now, or if you don't feel comfortable in front of the group, you can ask me later.